Hello, and welcome back to another episode of plantcare.club, where we care about your plants. On this show, we like to say that we do three things. Number one, we talk about your plants. Indoor, outdoor, whatever you've got, we talk about them. Number two, we do product reviews. So this would fall into a bit of a product review. We want to talk about today about fertilizer, but we'll talk about soil, pots. We'll do specific types of pots or soil, whatever is coming to the market. Or we can do brand new plants that are coming to the market. So new genetics, different types that are coming out. And last, we'd like to answer your questions. So if you think of any questions while you are listening to the show, head over to plantcare.club, fill out our question form, and we will either send you an email back with a reply, or we will answer it on a future show. At plantcare.club, we've got tons of other information on there too. There's blog posts, there's past episodes, there's tons to look at, there's tons to read. So if you're a plant enthusiast, head over there. It's a great resource to use. My name is Fred. I am a commercial greenhouse grower. I have about 6 years in the horticultural space. We grow everything from spring annuals to garden mums, poinsettias, and then we have a farm in Florida where we grow Majesty palms, Kimberly queen ferns, a lot of house plants, so inside, outside, mandevilla. So plants that you have all around your home, we send them across North America, across Canada and the United States, to different garden centers and retailers. So what we try to do on the show is take the experience that we have in the greenhouse and in the nursery, and then give you that information and how you can apply it to your own home. What can you actually take from what a grower does and apply it to your house? So today, as I mentioned, we're going to talk about fertilizer. Fertilizer is incredibly important to every plant, incredibly important to every grower. So important. It's one of the key building blocks for a grower. So I'm going to start by pointing out there are usually three numbers when you're looking at fertilizer. When you pick up a bag of fertilizer, usually it's right at the very front, and it's got three separate numbers. There's number dash number dash number. What does that mean? The first number is nitrogen. It's the nitrogen component in that fertilizer. The middle number is phosphorus. That's how much phosphorus is contained. The last one is potassium. Now these are three different nutrients that are very important to your plant's growth. Examples can be 15, 5, 15. So it would be 15 nitrogen, 5 phosphorus, 15 potassium. 20, 20, 20. Even across all three. It can be low at the front from let's say a 10, 52, 10. So the middle number can be very high. There's so many different variations. The reason for the variations are there are different fertilizers for different stages of growth in your plants. And what we want to do today is talk about when you're going to use the different types of fertilizers and why you might use it. Another thing to think about, this is a little bit more in the weeds, but if you multiply those numbers as a percentage by the weight of the bag, it'll give you an idea of how many pounds of that nutrient are in that bag. So for example, if the number is 20 and you have a 10-pound bag, well, 20% of 10 pounds is 2 pounds. So you would have, if you have a 20-20-20 bag of fertilizer, you're going to have 2 pounds of nitrogen, 2 pounds of phosphorus, 2 pounds of potassium. So that's roughly how that works out. And that can give you a bit more information into what you're feeding your plants and why you're feeding them that. But what does this actually mean for you? Well, there are two main types of fertilizer. Now, I know I'm going to miss organic fertilizers. I'm going to skip over something like coffee grounds. Some people say coffee grounds or banana peels, compost. Some people will even use manure in their gardens, that kind of a thing. The reason that I'm not talking about that is because I need to get an expert on that. We don't use any of that in a greenhouse setting. We don't use any compost. We use the manufactured fertilizers. So I'm not the expert on those types of fertilizer, and I would need an expert in order to talk to you about that. So I'm not even going to fib. I'm not going to kid around and try to yank your chain here and tell you that I know what I'm talking about as far as banana peels go. I need to get an expert on in order to talk about that. Two types of fertilizer that we would use in a commercial greenhouse: slow release, granular. Slow release fertilizer, you might see it it's very common in houseplants. They take the fertilizer, they mix it in with the soil, and they're like little green balls. They're very small, and it's mixed all the way down from the bottom to the top of the soil. Now, the point of slow release fertilizer is that as the roots get larger and they are working all the way down through that pot, they're getting to different areas of the soil. They're going to run into these little pockets of fertilizer. They can use that fertilizer and soak it up. It also is fertilizer that is there for a longer period of time. So you might, if you are a grower and you say, I don't have the ability to use liquid fertilizer all the time. I have to use more straight water, that I'm just going to water my plants directly. Well, then you might use more granular fertilizer, because that granular fertilizer will open up sporadically over the next, sometimes it's a few months, sometimes it's few over the course of a year or two. So that's where granular fertilizer, that is where slow release fertilizer, I lost the word. Slow release fertilizer can be so valuable is that it'll slowly just open up and continually provide nutrients to your plant. Granular fertilizer is what you see goes into the water. So if you use granular fertilizer, now you have to get the right mixing rate. So look on the back of the bag to figure out what exactly the right mixing ratio of water to granular fertilizer that you're going to use in order to get the right solution. But that will give you an idea of it usually comes out blue, and when you pour it onto the water, it'll seep all the way through. Now that just sits in the soil, and the plant can use that right away. Plants that have a really good root structure, that have a very strong set of roots that go all the way to the bottom of the pot. It's filling. If you take the pot off of the plant, you can see the roots all the way down the side, and they're circling around at the very bottom of the pot. They're going to be very responsive to different types of fertilizer that you pour on top of the soil, rolls down, fills all of that soil mass. They're going to be super responsive to that, and they're going to love it. So when should you use each? Well, it's pretty easy to say. You can use some broad strokes here and say that something like a 20-20-20 fertilizer is a growth fertilizer. When you have high numbers for all three items, for all three of those nutrients, that's generally more of a growth promoting fertilizer, something that you use early stage. If you have a small number at the beginning and larger numbers at the end, like let's say a 5-30-30, or something that's even growers will generally call finishing fertilizers. Now, the reason that it's a finishing fertilizer is it's giving the plant the nutrients it needs to become a little bit stronger, to fill out the different gaps in the space that they have maybe between leaves, and to really become a more full plant that you can't see through as much. In general, poinsettias will use a lot more 20-20 or 28-20 fertilizer early in the season, and then by the end of the season they might be using something that promotes them to fill out all those gaps in between. So that's the difference in fertilizers that you use depending on the time of year and when your crop is supposed to be finished. But what your question is, what do we use for my different areas of my house? So I'll start with your garden. In your garden, you are pretty solidly going to look at liquid fertilizer, because by the time you add slow release fertilizer, it might be wasted. The slow release fertilizer, as I mentioned, it can last for a long time, and if you put it in early in the season, even in May, some of it will still probably be prevalent in the soil as far as October. So you might have put those nutrients into the soil and it's not being used. So you're better off to use liquid fertilizer around once a week. Now, depending on how big you want your garden to get, you can probably use something like a 20 fertilizer, or you could use a 28-20. You probably don't need to use finishing fertilizer as much, because especially the closer you get to Canada, as you're moving up the United States, if you're using bedding plants, usually people are trying to push on their garden all the way up until they get to the winter, October, November, when they have to take their garden out for the frost and for the winter. So a fertilizer that promotes growth is probably what you can use there. Indoor pots. Liquid fertilizer, I would say in general, is something that you should look to use more often because by the time you take your pot out, you take your plant out of the pot, it would be very difficult to mix in more slow release fertilizer into that soil mass. You couldn't really get it into the middle of it, and there's probably slow release fertilizer that's already inside of that soil. So I would say you don't really have to worry about using slow release. Just go for it with some liquid fertilizer, probably once, maybe twice a week, depending on how often you really want to use it. And I will get to what if you use too much, what if you use too little. I will get to that later on. Okay, outdoor pots specifically. So let's say these are your hanging baskets, a patio pot, that kind of a thing. I would say you can use liquid fertilizer, very similar to your garden, where you can keep feeding it over the course of the summer. It is going to now. What you have to think about as well, the plant needs to balance the amount of sunlight that it's getting and the amount of fertilizer that it's getting. So if there's a lot more sunlight and heat in the summer, the plant can absorb more fertilizer. If you're moving into the winter, there's less sunlight and there's less heat. That plant is going to need less nutrients in order to survive. So during the summer, you can probably get away with fertilizing and watering more and more often. But as you move later on into the season and it begins to get colder, you have to think about, okay, I need to bring this back a little bit because we're always balancing those two. Now, let's talk about repotting because repotting is another option, another thing that a lot of people do. So let's say you're going from a 6-inch pot up to a 10-inch pot. You've got your soil around the outside. You're going to toss that 6-inch right into the middle of the 10-inch. Now what are you going to do? Well, before you even put it in there, I would say grab some slow release fertilizer and try to mix it in to the soil you're using for your 10-inch. So put it in the middle, put it in the bottom, wherever it is. Shake it all up so the slow release is all the way through there. That's what a lot of growers will do in Florida and that are growing in Florida, California. That's where a lot of your house plants come from. That's what they're doing there. And it's a great way to make sure that as throughout the next year or 6 months, that plant has the nutrients it needs in order to continue growing. You can probably get away with some liquid fertilizer by adding, let's say, triple 20. You're going to want to use something that is going to encourage growth. You don't want that plant to get lazy. And that's another thing, I forgot to mention this, but if you are using slow release fertilizer, it is going to encourage that plant to shoot roots further and further and further down into the new soil that you've just put in there because there's more nutrients down there. Once a plant sees, hey, there's more down here, it'll just keep going and going and going. If you're adding liquid fertilizer only to the very top, the roots might think, well, I'm getting all of the nutrients I need right here. I don't have to keep growing. I can grow a little bit, but I don't really need to keep growing because I get all the nutrients I need right here at the top of the pot. So adding in some slow release when you're up potting, when you're repotting is a great idea. Last item that I had here was propagation. So let's say you want to I always use a spider plant as my analogy because it's a very easy one to propagate, but you're going to take a spider plant and you want to take off one of the little babies. It's got some roots that are shooting out. You throw it into a 4-inch pot. What do? First little while, I would say, start out with just straight water. Put some water in. Try to keep, if you can, try to keep the pH of that water a little bit lower. But you add in some water and you want to encourage those roots to begin growing. Once you see that the roots are growing and the roots are shooting down further into the soil, then you can switch over and start to use fertilizer. If you use way too much fertilizer all at once, it can shock them. It can shock the plant. If you don't add any fertilizer, the leaves can start to go a little bit yellow. I would say you could, when you go from repotting, if you're propagating into a 4-inch pot and you go to repot into a 6-inch, then add in some more slow release. You could add slow release at the very beginning, but I don't think it's as necessary during propagation. Okay, so you might be thinking, how do I tell if I have too much fertilizer or not enough fertilizer? Let's start with too much fertilizer. And a classic example that I want to use is geraniums. Geraniums are usually an outdoor plant. Outdoor hanging basket. You find them. I'm sure you know what they look like. I don't even need to describe it anymore. With geraniums, if they have too much fertilizer, they can create something called rust. Is the general name of the disease that they have, which you see on the leaves. You're looking at one of the leaves, and it starts to go a little bit. You start to see some brown patches, brown or gray patches on the leaves. Generally, you will see this on not in the new growth, in some of the older growth, the older leaves. And the explanation that I have heard is that it is from cell explosion. If you want me to talk about this anymore, I need someone with a PhD because I don't know enough to keep on going on that one. But as far as I understand, when the plant has so much nutrients in that soil, the geranium is saying, oh my gosh, it's shooting all these nutrients straight up the stem. It's going all the way out. It's going to the leaf. And now they're saying, okay, balance out. I have so much nutrients. I need enough light to make all of this balance. The leaf is saying, hey, we don't have enough light. And bang, cells explode. Why? I don't know. I would need a PhD. If you want me to get into that, send me a message at plantcare.club. I can find someone smarter than me that knows how to answer your question. Okay, what about not enough fertilizer? What if my plant doesn't have, how do I tell if it doesn't have enough fertilizer? That's generally when you will start to see things go yellow. The example I'll use here is poinsettias. I know I sent out another episode in the past, which was on poinsettia bottom leaves, and when you're going to buy your poinsettia, what to look for. When you're going to buy your poinsettia, check out those bottom leaves. Not on the top. The top's going to have red or marble or pink, whatever the color that you picked is. The bottom ones are where you want to look. If they're a really dark green, that means that the plant has a lot of nutrients. It's healthy. It has everything that it needs to balance out. And the dark green means it's so happy. It's just continuing to go. If the leaves on the bottom are becoming more pale and yellow, that plant needs more nutrients. So how can you test if you're saying, okay, well, I see what you're saying and my leaves look a little bit yellow, but I don't want the cell explosion to happen. So what do? How do I know? And you want to take that next step. You can do an EC test. I know I've sent out an episode in the past on exactly how to conduct that kind of a test, or a pH test. Now a pH test is important because I mentioned this before, but if your pH is not in the right range, if your soil is too acidic or it's too basic, the plant cannot absorb the nutrients that are in the soil. So if your pH is all the way up at a 9 and you're growing $1 million calibrachoa and you keep fertilizing, it's going to have a ton of nutrients in that soil, but because the pH is so high, the plant can't absorb the nutrients out of that soil. So your pH, your EC could be part of the problems there. Now, I'm hoping that this has answered some of your questions on fertilizer, when to use it, what type to use. It can also give you a few questions. Like you might have some more questions coming out of this as, okay, I kind of get it, but I want to make sure that I'm on the right thought process or I'm thinking the right thing here. If you're really worried about some of this, send us a message at plantcare.club. We can answer your questions, as I mentioned, either on the show or we'll reply over email. And if you have any questions that came up over the course of the show, like, oh, I want you to go more in depth on something specifically, or what about my specific type of plant? Where should I be with it? Send us a message. We can do a little bit more research. I will talk to you guys again next time. Thanks.